The courtroom was silent, save for the steady tapping of the judge's pen against the wooden desk. All eyes were on the young boy standing in the middle of the room, his hands trembling as he clutched the edge of the defense table. He couldn't have been more than 16, with wide, uncertain eyes that darted nervously around the room. The boy's name was Marcus, and he had never been inside a courtroom before. For him, this was like standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure if he was about to fall or somehow find a way to climb back to safety. The judge, a middle-aged man with a sharp, commanding voice and an air of authority that seemed to fill the room, leaned back in his chair and studied Marcus with an expression that was equal parts disdain and amusement. He had seen countless cases like this before, a young boy from a troubled neighborhood standing before him, caught up in something bigger than he could handle. To the judge, this was just another day at work, another lesson to teach someone who he believed was headed down the wrong path. "You really think you're something, don't you?" the judge said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Coming in here, acting like you're innocent. Do you have any idea how many kids like you I've seen come and go in this courtroom? You think you're different, special?" The words hit Marcus like a slap. His head dropped slightly, and for a moment he couldn't bring himself to look up. But inside, a storm was brewing. He wasn't a bad kid, he knew that much. Sure, he had made mistakes, but who hadn't? He wanted to speak up, to defend himself, but the weight of the judge's words made it feel impossible to find his voice. The audience in the courtroom, a mix of strangers and a few familiar faces, sat on the edge of their seats. Some looked at Marcus with pity, others with judgment. His mother, sitting in the back row, clutched a tissue in her hands, silently willing her son to stay strong. She knew the world wasn't fair, especially not for boys like Marcus, but watching him stand there, so vulnerable, broke her heart in a way she couldn't put into words. The judge continued, clearly enjoying the control he held over the room. "I've been doing this job for 20 years, and I can tell just by looking at someone where they're headed. And let me tell you something, young man. You're headed nowhere fast." His words echoed in the stillness of the room, and for a moment, it felt like even the walls themselves were judging Marcus. But then, something shifted. Marcus, who had been standing there silently, finally lifted his head. His eyes met the judge's, and for the first time, there was a spark of defiance. It wasn't anger, not exactly, but something deeper, a quiet determination that refused to be extinguished. It was the kind of look that said, "You don't know me, you don't know my story." The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the boy's sudden courage. "What? You got something to say now? Go ahead and press me," he said mockingly, leaning forward as if daring Marcus to speak. Marcus opened his mouth, and though his voice was shaky at first, it grew stronger with every word. "You don't know me," he said, his tone steady. "You don't know where I've been, what I've been through, or what I'm trying to do with my life. You think you got me all figured out, but you don't." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, but the judge quickly silenced them with a wave of his hand. For a moment, he looked genuinely taken aback. And then, almost as if he felt the need to reassert his authority, he leaned back and smirked. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. What happened next was something no one in the courtroom could have predicted. A twist of events so unexpected, so shocking, that it would leave even the judge himself begging for mercy. But for now, Marcus could only stand there, waiting for what felt like a tidal wave to crash down on him, completely unaware of how his life was about to change in ways he couldn't even imagine. The room seemed to grow colder as Marcus stood there, the judge's smirk still lingering in the air like a bad smell. For a moment, Marcus felt a lump rise in his throat. The pressure of all those eyes on him was suffocating, and the weight of the judge's words pressed against his chest like a heavy stone. He glanced briefly at his mother, sitting near the back of the courtroom, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Her eyes met his, and though she didn't speak, her gaze said everything. "Stay strong, baby. You're not alone." Marcus thought back to the chain of events that had led him here. He wasn't some hardened criminal. In fact, this whole thing felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Just a few months ago, he had been an ordinary teenager trying to make sense of the chaos around him. Life in his neighborhood wasn't easy. It never had been. Every corner seemed to have its own set of challenges: poverty, crime, and the kind of despair that made it hard to believe in anything better. But Marcus had dreams, even if they felt distant and unreachable most days. He wanted to be an artist. Ever since he was a kid, he found comfort in drawing, in letting the pencil glide across the paper as his imagination came to life. For Marcus, art was an escape, a way to create a world far removed from the one he lived in. His sketchbook was his most prized possession. filled with drawings of everything from superheroes to detailed portraits of his mom and little sister Tasha. He even saved up his allowance to buy a set of colored pencils, refusing to let anyone else touch them. Those pencils were his tools for building a future he could only see in his dreams. But dreams didn't pay the bills, and Marcus knew that all too well. His mom worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, and even then there were nights when dinner was nothing more than a couple of sandwiches and a glass of water. Tasha, who was only 8, didn't complain much, but Marcus could see the way her big brown eyes lit up on the rare occasions when there was a full meal on the table. He'd do anything for his sister, and that was part of the reason he'd gotten into trouble in the first place. It had started with a simple favor, or at least, that's what Marcus thought at the time. A guy from the neighborhood, a smooth-talking older kid named Darnell, had approached Marcus one afternoon while he was sitting on the stoop, sketching in his notebook. Darnell was one of those guys who always seemed to have money in his pocket and new sneakers on his feet, despite never having a job. He had a way of making everything sound easy, even when he knew it wasn't. "Yo, Marcus," Darnell had said, leaning against the railing with a grin. "That's some sick drawing, man. You ever think about putting that talent to use?" Marcus had shrugged, unsure of where the conversation was going. "I just do it for fun," he'd said, flipping the page to start a new sketch. "Nah, man, you could do more than that," Darnell had replied. "I know some people who'd pay good money for talent like yours. You just got to know how to hustle, that's all." At the time, Marcus hadn't thought much of it. He'd heard plenty of guys like Darnell talk big about opportunities that never really went anywhere. But then Darnell had mentioned something else. How Marcus could make a quick $50 just by running a small errand for him. "It's nothing serious," Darnell had said, waving it off like it was no big deal. "Just a package drop. In and out, easy money." The $50 had sounded like a fortune to Marcus, especially with Tasha's birthday coming up and no money to spare for a gift. Against his better judgment, he'd agreed. It had seemed harmless enough at the time, a small package wrapped in brown paper, no questions asked. But the moment Marcus handed it off to the guy Darnell had told him to meet, things went sideways. Out of nowhere, 2 police officers had appeared, their voices sharp as they demanded to know what Marcus was doing. The package turned out to be drugs, something Marcus hadn't even considered when he agreed to the errand. No amount of explaining or pleading could convince the officers that he hadn't known what he was carrying. And now, here he was, standing in front of a judge who seemed all too eager to make an example out of him. Marcus snapped back to the present as the judge cleared his throat, his voice breaking through the haze of memories. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, addressing the defense attorney who stood next to Marcus, "does your client have anything else to say for himself, or are we wasting more of the court's time?" Marcus glanced at his attorney, a man in his late 40s with tired eyes and a suit that looked like it hadn't been dry cleaned in months. Mr. Carter had been assigned to Marcus's case as a public defender, and while he seemed well-meaning, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was just another case on a long list of cases. "Your Honor," Mr. Carter began, his tone measured, "I think it's important to consider the context here. My client is a young man with no prior record who was misled by someone older and more experienced in manipulating vulnerable individuals. He's not a hardened criminal. He's a kid who made a mistake." The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "A mistake, huh?" he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Well, Mr. Carter, mistakes have consequences. And in my courtroom, we don't let those consequences slide just because someone is young." Marcus felt a surge of frustration rise in his chest. He wanted to shout to tell the judge that he wasn't some bad kid trying to scam the system. He wanted to explain how he'd just been trying to help his sister, how he hadn't known what was in the package. But he knew it wouldn't matter. People like the judge didn't see the struggles of kids like him. They only saw the mistakes. The judge leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Marcus. "Let me give you some advice, young man," he said. "Life isn't fair. The sooner you learn that, the better off you'll be. Now, unless you have something more to say, I think we're done here." Marcus's heart sank, but he forced himself to stand tall. He wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of his story. He wasn't going to let this moment define him, no matter how impossible it seemed. As the judge prepared to deliver his ruling, a commotion erupted at the back of the courtroom. The doors swung open, and a figure stepped inside, their presence commanding immediate attention. The room fell silent, and even the judge looked momentarily stunned. Marcus turned to see who it was, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea that the events about to unfold would change everything, not just for him, but for everyone in the room. The figure who stepped into the courtroom carried an energy that shifted the atmosphere immediately. Dressed sharply in a dark suit, with an air of confidence and purpose, they strode down the aisle with a determination that silenced even the quiet murmurs from the audience. Marcus squinted, trying to place the face. It wasn't someone he recognized. Yet the way the stranger carried themselves made it clear they weren't just another curious bystander. Whoever they were, they had come here for a reason. The judge frowned, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "Who are you, and what business do you have in my courtroom?" he barked, his gavel poised to restore order. "Apologies for the intrusion, Your Honor," the figure said, their voice calm but firm. "My name is Rebecca Turner. I'm a community advocate and legal consultant. I believe I can provide some context that this court urgently needs to hear before any decisions are made." The judge's expression darkened. "Miss Turner, this is highly irregular. We are in the middle of proceedings. If you have information relevant to this case, you should have submitted it beforehand." "With all due respect, Your Honor, I didn't have the opportunity," Rebecca replied smoothly. "I only learned of this case a few hours ago. But what I had to say is critical, not only for this young man, but for the integrity of the court's decision." The judge hesitated, clearly irritated but also intrigued. After a long pause, he gestured toward her. "You have 2 minutes. Make it quick." Rebecca turned to face the courtroom, her eyes scanning the faces before finally landing on Marcus. She gave him a small, reassuring nod before addressing the judge. "Marcus Carter is not a criminal. He is a 16-year-old boy who made a poor decision under difficult circumstances. But what this court may not fully appreciate is the broader context of what led him to this moment." She paused, allowing her words to settle. The room remained silent, every pair of eyes glued to her. "The person who handed Marcus that package is part of a larger operation targeting vulnerable kids in low-income neighborhoods. They prey on their desperation, their need to help their families, and their dreams of a better life. These kids aren't given a choice. They are manipulated, coerced, and used as scapegoats for the real criminals who profit from their mistakes." Marcus felt a wave of relief and shame wash over him at the same time. Someone finally understood what he'd been through, but hearing it laid out like that made him feel exposed. He glanced at his mom again, who now had tears streaming silently down her face. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "That may be true," he said after a moment, "but it doesn't absolve the defendant of responsibility for his actions. He still made the choice to participate." Rebecca nodded as if she'd expected this response. "You're right, Your Honor. Accountability is important. But justice isn't just about punishment. It's about understanding, rehabilitation, and making sure the punishment fits the crime. Marcus has no prior record. He's a talented young artist with aspirations to make something of himself. He doesn't belong in a detention facility where he'll only be exposed to more negative influences. He needs a second chance." Before the judge could respond, the prosecutor, a stern-looking man with a clipboard full of notes, stood up. "Your Honor, while I appreciate Ms. Turner's passion, this case isn't about the systemic issues she's highlighting. It's about this defendant's actions. He knowingly transported an illegal substance. That's a crime, plain and simple." Rebecca didn't flinch. Instead, she turned to the prosecutor, her tone steady. "And do you think prosecuting this boy to the fullest extent of the law will fix the problem? Or will it just ensure that the cycle continues? Because I can promise you, there are dozens of other kids being targeted right now, just like Marcus was. If we don't address the root of the issue, we're not solving anything." The tension in the room was palpable. Even the judge seemed to be grappling with the weight of her words. Marcus, meanwhile, felt something stir inside him, a glimmer of hope that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in weeks. For the first time, he began to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could turn out differently. But then, just as it seemed the tide might be turning, the doors to the courtroom opened again. This time, it wasn't a poised advocate who entered but a man Marcus knew all too well. Darnell. He was dressed in his usual flashy style, a bright jacket, oversized watch, and sneakers that probably cost more than most people made in a month. He sauntered into the room like he owned the place, his cocky grin faltering only slightly when he realized everyone was staring at him. Marcus's stomach dropped. What was Darnell doing here? His heart raced as he tried to figure out if this was some kind of setup. Darnell had been the one to drag him into this mess in the first place, and now seeing him here, Marcus couldn't help but feel like things were about to get even worse. The judge, clearly irritated by yet another interruption, slammed his gavel. "Who are you, and why are you disrupting my courtroom?" Darnell hesitated for a moment before speaking. Your Honor, my name's Darnell. He had to speak on behalf of Marcus. Marcus' eyes widened in disbelief. Whatever Darnell was about to say, Marcus knew it couldn't be good. Darnell wasn't the type to help anyone unless there was something in it for him. Rebecca turned to Darnell, her expression worry. "And what exactly do you have to say?" she asked, her tone careful. Darnell scratched the back of his neck, his usual bravado suddenly replaced by nervousness. "Look, I just wanted to say that Marcus, he didn't know what was in the package. I should have told him, but I didn't. So, if anyone's to blame, it's me." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, and the judge quickly called for order. Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. Was Darnell actually taking responsibility, or was this some kind of trick? The judge studied Darnell for a long moment before speaking. "If what you're saying is true, then you've just admitted to orchestrating an illegal operation. Are you prepared to face the consequences of that?" Darnell's confidence seemed to falter completely. His eyes darted around the room as if looking for an escape. I just... Before he could finish, a pair of uniformed officers stepped forward from the back of the courtroom, their expressions grim. Darnell froze, realizing he'd just implicated himself. The tension in the room reached a breaking point as the officers approached him, placing handcuffs around his wrists. As they led Darnell away, Marcus felt a mix of emotions: relief, confusion, and fear of what would happen next. Rebecca stepped closer to him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Stay strong, Marcus," she whispered. "This isn't over yet." The judge, clearly shaken by the unexpected turn of events, called for a brief recess. Marcus was left standing there, the weight of everything crashing down on him. He didn't know what the outcome would be, but one thing was certain: his life would never be the same.